Corporación Humanas. La primera exposición va a ser en inglés para aquellos que deseen la traducción simultánea.
Hola, muy buenas tardes a todas y a todos. Espero que hayan disfrutado de su almuerzo y se hayan tomado un buen café para poder estar atentos a este tercer panel que va a estar muy interesante. Antes de comenzar, quisiera hacer una breve referencia a lo que desde la Mesa Intersectorial sobre Trata de Personas hemos estado haciendo en materia de víctima. Nosotros contamos con un plan de acción nacional contra la trata de personas y uno de sus ejes es de protección y asistencia a víctimas. Quizás el producto más importante de dicho eje es el Protocolo Intersectorial de Atención a Víctimas de Trata. Este es un mecanismo de coordinación que articula la oferta de asistencia comprometida por las instituciones públicas, organismos de la sociedad civil y organismos internacionales que lo integran. El objeto de este mecanismo es asegurar el ejercicio efectivo de los derechos de las víctimas y evitar la sobreintervención de las mismas. El protocolo es coordinado por el Programa de Apoyo a Víctimas de la Subsecretaría de Prevención del Delito. Se ha implementado de manera piloto desde el 2014 en la región metropolitana y desde este año se está adecuando su implementación en todas las regiones del país. A través del protocolo, las víctimas reciben atención en las siguientes áreas: protección, alojamiento. Queremos recordar que el CERNAM tiene una casa de acogida para mujeres víctimas de trata. Salud, asistencia jurídica, regulación migratoria. La ley 20.507 contempla un permiso de residencia especial para las víctimas de trata, asistencia social y educación. Tanto el protocolo como todas las medidas que establece el plan de acción en sus otros ejes están guiadas en su implementación por ciertos principios orientadores. En efecto, todas las acciones encaminadas a combatir la trata de personas deben dar a entender asegurar una protección integral de las víctimas. ¿Qué significa esto? Que se tendrán en consideración las necesidades específicas de las víctimas de trata, que su opinión será valorada y que la asistencia que el Estado brinda a estas víctimas no estará subordinada a si éstas puedan o quieran participar en el proceso penal ni al éxito por supuesto sin perjuicio de las medidas de protección que puede decretar el Ministerio Público en el contexto del proceso penal. Lo anterior implica que, por ejemplo, una víctima que ha sido detectada por una ONG puede ingresar al protocolo de atención a víctimas y recibir sus prestaciones, independientemente de si después esa causa es formalizada por otro delito o es archivada provisionalmente o sobreseída. Por otra parte, el plan de acción establece que sus acciones tendrán a incentivar la denuncia y participación de las víctimas en el proceso penal, tanto por la responsabilidad que les cabe al Estado en proteger a otras eventuales víctimas y desbaratar organizaciones criminales, como porque se entiende que el proceso judicial es parte integrante del proceso de reparación de la víctima. Quisiera también aprovechar este momento para recalcar que el delito de trata de personas puede ser interno y externo, o sea, puede haber cruce de fronteras o no haber cruce de fronteras, y que si bien hasta el 31 de diciembre del 2014 todas las causas formalizadas por trata de personas eran respecto a víctimas extranjeras, durante el año, 31 de diciembre del 2015, durante el año 2015 el protocolo de asistencia a víctimas asistió a 7 víctimas chilenas que retornaron del extranjero, que fueron víctimas de trata de personas. Sin más, el objetivo de este panel es precisamente conocer las características de la víctima del delito de trata de personas, las necesidades de asistencia y protección que presentan y el impacto de dichas medidas en la persecución penal. Invitamos a los expositores a compartir con nosotros las buenas prácticas identificadas desde el ejercicio de sus funciones. En primer lugar, doy la palabra al señor Matthew Luciano, jefe de la Unidad de Asistencia a Migrantes Vulnerables de la sede central de la Organización Internacional para las Migraciones. Entre sus funciones se encuentra la supervisión de políticas y asesoramiento técnico en la protección, asistencia a migrantes, incluyendo las víctimas de trata. El señor Luciano tiene más de 15 años de experiencia en gestión migratoria y protección de migrantes, trabajando con gobiernos y organizaciones asociadas en la implementación de programas para el reforzamiento de los derechos de los migrantes y el combate contra la trata de personas. Antes de su posición actual en Ginebra, sirvió para OIM Bélgica, Indonesia y Egipto.
Thank you very much. and good afternoon, everyone. First, my apologies for speaking in English. I hope you all are equipped with the translation gear. But first, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting myself and IOM today. It's really a pleasure to be here and to join today's anniversary. As the Minister of Interior said this morning, today's event, it's really an opportunity to look back, I guess, on what has been accomplished over the past 5 years, but also think ahead in terms of challenges and opportunities, and that's exactly what I was asked to present on. Really looking at the challenges and opportunities in the field of victim assistance, victim protection, but also in the field of anti-trafficking from a global perspective. Just a brief introduction on IOM, because some of you may not know the organization. So the IOM, the International Organization for Migration, is an intergovernmental organization headquartered in Geneva. We have offices throughout the world, and we work mostly with our member states, 162 member states, and directly with migrants as well, providing a range of services. Technical assistance to government on various issues. Trafficking is only one aspect. We work a lot on labor mobility, emergency response, transportation, assisted voluntary return, border management, and then providing as well direct assistance to migrants, including victims of trafficking. So we have assistance programs all over the world as well. We assist more or less with our partners, 7,000 victims per year. And we've assisted over the past 20 years, 85,000 victims. Again, working very much in very close cooperation with our government partners and civil society organizations. So I'll make a presentation. I'll speak for half an hour, 30 minutes, I think, and I'll talk about three. My presentation is structured into three main points. The first one, it's really, more an introduction, is to provide you with just global overview of trafficking. I'll be actually brief on this one because you've heard a lot about this morning already. Maybe I'll just insist on a couple of points that I think are particularly important, even though they may have been mentioned this morning already. Then I'll talk about global opportunities. And here mostly I'll briefly discuss and present the 2030 agenda, which has been adopted by the UN Summit last year, and what chances it brings actually to the anti-trafficking agenda, and how it's an opportunity for the UN and UN member states. And then I'll discuss about some key challenges in the field of victim protection and trafficking more broadly that I think are particularly important to IOM and to you, hopefully. So really, again, as I said, I'm not going to talk too much about what trafficking is, but obviously it's modern slavery, gross violation of human rights, the world's third most profitable criminal business. All of this was said this morning. We mentioned as well the Palermo Protocol, which came into force 15 years ago. More than 90% of countries today have domestic legislation on trafficking. That said, and that's what I wanted to insist on during this introduction, is that we've been working a lot ourselves, the international community, states, since the Palermo Protocol on combating trafficking. But the sad truth is that we don't know, and we're not sure if actually human trafficking is any less prevalent today than it was when it started working. So that's why I'll be happy to actually outline some key challenges that I think are important. Maybe one point as well that I'd like to insist on. Again, I'm not going to discuss the reasons why trafficking exists and the vulnerabilities that communities and that migrants may actually face. This was discussed at length this morning. I just want to mention one thing which I think is important, is that we should not forget that in our globalized world, the root cause and the main cause for trafficking remains the demand for cheap labor and cheap and sexual services. So indeed, there are actually contributing factors that make people, migrants, vulnerable to trafficking, and that exacerbate the risk that they may fall prey to traffickers. But the root cause is indeed the demand that exists for cheap labor and other services. So just, sorry. I mentioned the Palermo Protocol. So again, this was discussed at length this morning, the three elements of the crime: action, means, and purpose. But I just want to insist on the means. Why? Because we discussed consent this morning. So I want to maybe highlight, what was said this morning, that consent is actually irrelevant when any of the means have been used. That was mentioned. And on the issue of identifying victims and using the definition, I like to actually discuss and present. I think that according to me, there are three main questions that have to be that one has to ask actually to determine whether a person is a victim of trafficking or not. So it's something that we usually explain when I train people, or that I use and that we use when we have to screen migrants or people in situations where we don't have the time and the luxury to carry out long interviews and one-to-one discussion with victims, like when we've been screening new migrants, for instance, in detention centers or at border points where actually large case movements of migrants come across. So I think there's indeed three questions that one has to ask at the end: is what were you promised before you left? The second one would be, what did you get compared to what you were promised? And the third one, and that just relates to the mean, is, can you get out of it? And I think that's an important one. Can you get out of the exploitative situations you're in? And that's where actually I wanted to insist again, based on the discussion this morning, that sometimes it's really easy to actually determine that the person was in a situation where she or he couldn't get out. There's people just can be physically, there's the chains, physical chains, and people can just be locked up. We have, recent cases that IOM assisted. There was 1,200 fishermen on fishing boats in the Indonesian waters. Obviously, those people that were rescued by the authorities and assisted by IOM, they'd been locked up on boats, on the sea for years, in exploitative situations, and couldn't, some, hadn't been on dry land for years. That's an obvious situation where, indeed, the people, the person cannot get out of it physically because, they're imprisoned, right? But sometimes it's been more complicated and complex than that. And that's what we talk about modern slavery, that those chains can be invisible. But it doesn't mean, again, that they're not as strong as physical chains. So again, there's been a lot of examples given this morning, but I just wanted to maybe insist a bit on this based on example. There's been lots of discussion this morning. I jotted down again some examples of those invisible chain. Again, sometimes, like I said, it can be straightforward. People locked up on boats, or people not free of moving, people whose passports have been confiscated, people who actually are subject to violence. That's another invisible chain. Or threats of violence. That's another one, to themselves, but also to their families back home. That's something that we discussed, briefly over lunch, about the mules, whose relatives have been kidnapped by the traffickers, which forces them indeed to carry out those criminal activities. So threats, that's even more the case maybe for irregular migrants who fear deportation, and the threats that they would be reported to the authorities if they try to escape. And then the issue that, unfortunately, we see a lot when we talk about labor migrant and labor migration and the situation of trafficking for forced labor is the issue of debt bondages. Bondage meaning that migrants would actually incur debt to be able to pay for their trip, to be able to pay for recruitment fees. They, for instance, would sell their land, and then, of course, when they're actually in the job, and even if the job is not that they were promised or actually in an exploitative situation, they just can't get out because they owe quite a lot of money to the recruitment agent because maybe their salary is actually withheld and they're not getting any salary for, best case scenario, maybe 3 months, 6 months, or not at all. So I just wanted to, again, a lot of that has been mentioned this morning, but I just wanted to insist on the means because there's been lots of discussions and questions this morning about that, and I thought it would be, again, important based on our experience and the contacts we also have with migrants and trafficked victims to give some of these examples. So that was my brief introduction. So now just wanted to also briefly put your national discussions into a global context and mention about the opportunities that the Agenda 2030 present. I don't know how familiar you may be with the agenda, which is replacing the Millennium Development Goals, and which was adopted by the UN and member states and defining a series of sustainable development goals. So what's important is that it is actually a useful tool when it comes to trafficking, because the intention of the agenda was to leave no one behind, including migrants, and migration has been inserted heavily and significantly taken into account by member states when devising the new agenda. And again, trafficking, forced migration, and victim protection is featured in the agenda. It's well integrated in the agenda, which reflects strong evidence again of a renewed commitment by member states, by the UN, and by all countries to address trafficking. So there are indeed one target, 8.7. I don't know if you can read, but which calls upon all member states to take immediate and effective measures to eradicate forced labor and modern slavery and human trafficking, and secure the prohibition and elimination of the world's worst forms of child labor. There are two other targets, 5.2 and 16.2, which deal specifically with trafficking of children and trafficking of women and girls. So I just wanted to mention that as well as an opportunity for in the fight against trafficking. So as I said in the introduction, we don't know and we can't say confidently that we have made, ourselves and the international community as a whole, any progress in reducing the prevalence of trafficking for the past 15 years. And according to IOM, there may be 3 areas where more concerted efforts would be required. The first one is indeed increasing and enhancing the level of protection that's available for victims. So we have made some progress, and and Chile is a good example of in improving the level of protection that's available to victims, of course. But the issue remains that the level of persons and victims that benefit from those protection framework is really low. So if you look at the figures, again, we talked about the estimates on trafficking. I'm not going to insist on that, but 600,000 to 4 million persons trafficked every year. According to, I think it's a figure by ODC, 45,000 victims are actually identified annually, and 6,000 being actually prosecuted or convicted. But what I want you to actually highlight is really the gap between the 600,000 to 4 million, whichever end we choose, and the 50,000 victims that actually are benefiting from protection every year. So one of the challenge, remains in providing effective protection to victims, remain the identification of victims of trafficking. We have maybe 1 billion migrants, people on the move. One person in 7. If we count international migrants, 250 million and 750 million of internal migrants. How many of them are being trafficked? That's a question, and how many are being identified? What we know, and again, that was mentioned this morning, that when we started working on trafficking, I mean, there was a strong focus on females, I mean, women and girls being trafficked for sexual exploitation. I mean, the trends, I mean, show that labor, trafficking for forced labor is actually extremely prevalent, and more victims of forced labor are being identified. But there was indeed, as was mentioned by Lorena this morning as well, I mean, a gender bias. So, for instance, I mean, and I think you would agree with me, and that's the case, for instance, in the European context, is that if you're a young male who's been working irregularly, I mean, there's little chance that you're going to be actually screened and identified as a victim of trafficking because of this bias. And you may also not identify yourself as a victim and go and access, any service or protection you may actually be entitled to. And this is particularly the case. Again, I just gave the example of Europe. And the problem of identification is even more acute in the context of what we call mixed migratory flows. So migratory flows that comprise many different types of migrants who travel together along the same routes, taking the same routes. They can be asylum seekers and refugees, economic migrants, and including as well victims of trafficking. And those countries, I mean, it's important for those countries affected by those flows to be able to screen migrants and refugees arriving and be able to actually determine the vulnerabilities of the migrants, and then if they're actually victims of trafficking or not, so that they can benefit of the protection they deserve. And I would just wanted to give you a really quick example of a survey that was conducted by IOM really recently among a sample of migrants and refugees traveling along the Western Balkans, so on the way from Turkey, from Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, neighboring countries, to Europe through Turkey. So we actually interviewed 2,000 migrants and refugees, and the idea was to test. I mean, we had a proxy of indicators to help us define and determine potentially of trafficking and exploitation, and we actually found out that nearly 1 in 10 migrant and refugee respondents had answered positively to one of the indicators on the presence of trafficking and other exploitative practices. So indeed, I'm not going to enter in detail, but that was the questions. But what's important is that indeed the findings, 1 in 10. So it's really a challenge. For countries and for states to be able to, among those migrants, to be able to determine and screen for the individuals who determine their vulnerabilities and whether or not they may be victims of trafficking. We tend to focus indeed on those who may need international protection and meet the 51 Refugee Convention requirements, and the others. But among the others, some may also have some vulnerabilities that need to be taken into account, including victims of trafficking. So it's really important to be able to put in place systems, train frontline respondents on identification, and then put in place some referral mechanisms so that people can be timely identified, but also referred to specialized services, the services they may need that we discussed this morning: shelter, legal aid, voluntary return and reintegration, if indeed the appropriate. Okay, so indeed, there's no easy solution to this issue of the low number of victims being identified. But what's important indeed is that training is one, capacity building of police, of course, and other law enforcement agencies, immigration officials, but also anybody who may actually enter in contact with a victim. There's been a lot of focus on this region and in Chile on health officials, and that's indeed the right thing to do. There's no quick solution. Another solution is actually to ensure, greater commitment to protecting the human rights of all migrants as a first step as well, to promote actually identification of victims, but also other vulnerabilities. Second challenge, how am I doing with time? Which is indirectly related to protection, but which I wanted to actually insist on, is the issue of prevention and the issue of the demand side. As I said in the introduction, the root cause and the main reason why trafficking exists is because there is a demand for cheap labor or sexual services. Indeed, there are contributing factors that make people vulnerable to trafficking that should be addressed as well, but there's a need to also focus on the demand side. Traditionally, I mean, the efforts of the international community have focused more on this, what we call the supply side. So looking at communities at risk of trafficking or groups at risk of trafficking and trying to, with various types of intervention, I mean, trying to raise their understanding and awareness of what trafficking is, of the risks involved with trafficking, irregular migration, fraudulent job offers. So lots of information, education among vulnerable groups, but also some community empowerment and livelihoods enhancements in those source communities. With some impacts, of course, I don't want to deny there has been there's been an impact, but with the need indeed for complementary measures to really address the demand side. So there's been recently more attention brought to this issue, and I want to mention, for instance, one paper that was issued by the ICAT, which is the Interagency Coordinating Group Against Trafficking, which is a body that's been created by the UN General Assembly that comprises 16 UN agencies and IOM, including UNODC. There's a working group that includes IOM, ODC, UNHCR, ILO, UNICEF, and OHCHR. And we last year, issued this position paper, this policy paper on the demand side. I mean, how to address the demand side. So it's available online, and I'm happy to actually tell you as well where you can find it. But it makes recommendation and highlights 6 areas and 6 strategies to address demand, which are here. I'm not sure you can actually read them really well, but it's the first one is strengthening criminal justice responses, which serve to reduce demand that fosters trafficking for labor exploitation. So working, for instance, through labor inspectors and ensuring that, I mean, there are appropriate regulations for this. I mean, the second one is to promote measures and mechanisms to improve labor conditions in sectors vulnerable to the use of victims of trafficking for labor exploitation. The third one, and I'll insist a little on this one, is to take action against exploitation associated with the migration process, including through better regulation of private recruitment agencies. The fourth one, encouraging private sector initiatives to address exploitative labor practices within their supply chains. The fifth one, which I think is really important, promoting consumer-based action against products made from trafficked labor. So really looking at the consumers, the end consumers, you, me. And the last one, addressing the root causes and contributing factors, including social norms that enable exploitative practices to flourish. So I'll just insist on 2, and then I'll conclude. My third point would be my conclusion. But I mean, the issue of recruitment when it comes to trafficking for labor exploitation is a really important one. I mean, recruitment is the first step in the migration process, and if recruitment is tainted with unethical practices, fraudulent practices, if migrants are actually charged excessive recruitment fees or recruitment fees at all, there is a chance, there is a risk that there's going to be a knockdown effect, and that would actually lead to trafficking for forced exploitation, for trafficking for labor exploitation. So there's a really important issue to address is the issue of recruitment and promoting ethical recruitment. And there, governments have a role to play, but also the industry, the recruitment industry for sure, and global multinationals. And that's where maybe it's a bit difficult to work on this on the demand side, is really because of the actors we're dealing with and the role that the private sector has to play. So I made 2 points, 2 challenges I wanted to highlight. The first one was the issue of protection, of course, but most importantly, the issue of identification and the lack of identification of victims. And the second one was the issue of more prevention, but really looking at the demand side. The third point, but it's more of a conclusion I want to highlight, is the need to strengthen the evaluation of our anti-trafficking responses. And again, that ties back a little bit to the Agenda 2030 and how we're going to measure progress and the impact of what governments, international organizations, NGOs, I mean, all the actors actually carry out to combat trafficking. And again, I mean, I'll just mention a forthcoming paper by the ICAT as well. I mean, we've been really looking closely at the issue of evaluation and did a survey of evaluation of counter-trafficking programs for the past 15 years, and the issue is indeed it's not specific to counter-trafficking. It's an issue with development work, I think, in general. But there is issue of a lack of systematic information collected from programs, and difficulty to measure the impact because of a lack of data, for instance, and many different issues that hamper the evaluation of anti-trafficking projects. So that's again something that I'm not going to enter into detail now. I just really food for thought, as you also, I mean, are measuring progress, the progress you've achieved over the past 5 years, and think about what you're going to do next. I mean, think about the issue of monitoring and evaluation, and be able to actually ensure that the results that are set are actually achieved. Thank you.
Agradecemos la presentación del señor Luciano. Como sabemos que el último panel siempre es un panel más difícil, la gente está más cansada, hemos programado el coffee break para este momento, así que tienen 15 minutos afuera a tomar un café y volver para seguir con el resto de los expositores.
En Chile existe la trata de personas.
Este delito es la nueva forma de esclavitud del siglo XXI.
Las personas